There was a medieval proverb that said, "Winter eateth what summer groweth." And so to survive a medieval winter, people would have to stockpile the foods that they had growing in the summer. Then all winter long they could make dishes like frumenty, a wheat porridge perfect for keeping away the cold. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we try to survive a medieval winter, this time on Tasting History. Frumenty is one of those dishes that would have been eaten by all members of society, from a serf to a monk to the king himself. That said, there were definitely differences between the version served to a peasant and the one at a royal banquet. Now, both of them would have been a wheat or sometimes barley porridge mixed with egg and milk. But in some of the nicer recipes, you find a lot of spices or even sugar. Other recipes might include venison stock or even call for the dish to be served with a side of venison. There's even one recipe in the form of curry from England that calls for the frumenty to be served alongside porpoise. Definitely a dish reserved for royalty. But I'm not concerned with how the royals will survive winter. I trust they'll be just fine. I'm more concerned with how the average person would have eaten. And so I wanted to find a simple frumenty recipe, and I did so in the French cookbook Blvd de Tevon, written around the year 1300. It's for frumenty. Take wheat, prepare it, wash it very well, and cook it in water. When it is cooked, drain it. Take cow's milk and bring it to a boil, add the wheat, and boil it again, stirring frequently. Remove it from the fire, stir often, and add in plenty of beaten egg yolks. And it should not be too hot when they are added. Some people add spices, a little saffron and venison stock. It should be yellowish and quite thick. So even this recipe gives the option for a fancier frumenty, saying that it can be made with spices and venison stock, or saffron, though the saffron is actually just there to color it if the egg yolks don't do enough. That said, I'm guessing most peasants really didn't care what the color of the dish was in the end, so they probably wouldn't bother adding any saffron. They were more just concerned with keeping warm. So it's a pity that they didn't have access to these comfy slippers that I got from today's sponsor, Bombas. Bombas produces some of the comfiest slippers, socks, underwear, and t-shirts. And everything is made with premium materials and fits like a glove, or like a sock. And should it not fit, well then you can return it, because you can return it for free or exchange it for absolutely any reason at all, but I am sure that you won't want to, because I've been happy with everything that I've got from them. My favorite t-shirt is now Bombas, my favorite socks are now Bombas. I just got another pair of compression socks from Bombas because I'm getting ready to go on a long flight, and the best thing to wear on a long flight is compression socks. And it's not just about getting you a wonderful article of clothing, but also helping others get them too, because for every item sold, they donate an item to those in need. Namely, socks, underwear, and t-shirts, the most requested items at shelters. One item purchased is one item donated. So feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing that your purchase will do some real good. And new customers get 20% off of their first order when you use my link in the description or go to bombas.com/tastinghistory and use my code tastinghistory20. Now on to the porpoiseless frumenty. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 cup or 200 grams of wheat berries, 1 cup or 235 milliliters whole milk or almond milk. Almond milk would have been used during fasting days and during Lent, which is mostly during the winter, so you can use almond milk, but if you do that, then you really shouldn't be using egg yolks. But I'm not making this during Lent, so I'm using regular milk and 3 egg yolks. Also a half teaspoon of salt and some optional saffron. Now the French recipe does not actually mention salt, but it would have been commonly used at the time, and it is mentioned in a wonderful recipe from 1430 along with sugar, and my favorite thing about the recipe is that it's told like a poem. Color it with saffron and salt it well, and serve it forth, sir, at the meal. With sugar candy thou mayest douse, if it be served in a great lord's house. Take black sugar for meaner men, beware therewith, for it will burn. So here again it says that if it is being made for a great lord, you can go ahead and add some sugar, or even black sugar, which is just a less refined version of sugar, if it is being served to meaner men or somebody with less wealth. But I'm not going to use any, but if you want to sweeten it up, then you can. It will still be historically accurate. So first, rinse the wheat and then drain it. Then bring a quart of water to a boil and add the wheat in. Let it return to a boil, then reduce the heat to a simmer, cover the pot, and leave it to simmer for another 30 minutes or until it's nice and soft. By this time, most of the water should have been absorbed, and any that hasn't been, you can drain off. Now some recipes, like the one that calls for porpoise, has you add the egg yolks to the milk before heating the milk up. Now you can add it later, like this recipe says, but you run the risk of having them curdle or scramble basically, and you'll have scrambled eggs. That is not good. So If you want to mitigate that, then you should add the egg yolks to the milk right now. Just beat them and add them to the milk as well as the salt. Also, if you do want to add some ground saffron to make it more colorful, then you can do so now. Either way, pour it into a small pot and set it over low heat and slowly bring it to a simmer. Again, you don't want to end up with scrambled eggs, so make sure you're doing a slow heating. Once it starts to steam, then add in the wheat and raise the temperature to medium and let it continue to come to a gentle boil, stirring it so it doesn't burn to the bottom of the pot as it thickens. And once it's thickened, it is ready to eat. And the original recipe does mention that it should be nice and thick. As my Nana would say, it should stick to your ribs. And it should do that because that way it'll stay with you, keep you warm through a medieval winter. There was a period from around the year 900 to 1300 where Europe was uncharacteristically warm, and they gave it the clever name of the medieval warm period. But starting around 1300, everything changed.
Winter is coming.
This was the beginning of what later would be more cleverly called the Little Ice Age. And while this period wouldn't see its coldest temperatures until around the 17th and 18th century, the 14th century kicked off with some wicked winters. In 1303, 1306, and 1307, much of the Baltic Sea froze over, and in the winter of 1363 to 64, there were long stretches of the Rhine River that froze solid for 2 months straight. And while you might expect that kind of weather in Northern Europe, Southern Europe also faced winter's wrath. In the winter of 1216, the Po River in Italy froze over solid, so much so that they were able to have a jousting tournament on it. And in February of 1352, the city of Florence in Italy was blanketed with snow for the entire month. A contemporary wrote that the snow rose to an extraordinary height, so to lighten up the roofs, the snow was thrown into the street, and some of the towns were blocked so the inhabitants were trapped for several days in their homes. I'm really hoping that that's not the case when I go to Florence next month, because I am not prepared for that kind of weather. Now, I'm sure that these harsh winters were hard on absolutely everyone, but there were some who were better prepared to handle them. I mean, a castle can be drafty, sure, but at least you have a raging fire in pretty much every room, tapestries on the walls to hold in the warmth, and of course, plenty of warm clothing to wear. Now, often this disparity, of course, had to do with money, but sometimes it was simply because of your social status. Regardless of if you could afford it or not, you weren't allowed to wear certain types of clothing. In the sumptuary laws from England in 1363, there were rules set in place that said that certain types of fabric, as well as certain types of fur, sometimes fur at all, could not be worn by the majority of society, regardless of if they could actually afford it or not. But winter wasn't just about keeping warm, but keeping fed. That same year that the jousting tournament took place on the frozen Po River, an Italian chronicler wrote that it was so cold that bread, apples, and pears, and all manner of food froze solid, and it could not be cut or eaten until they had been warmed up and thawed out by a fire. They even said that the wine froze in the casks, and to get it out they had to hack at it with an axe. When rivers froze, especially in areas that were unaccustomed to that kind of weather, it made distributing the food that they did have very difficult, as much of the food would have gone by boat down those rivers. In addition, the freezing would damage the watermills, which in the medieval period were numerous, and this meant that grain couldn't be ground into flour, so instead of bread, you had to eat something like the frumenty that we're making today. But while there were those who were caught unawares by the cold, most people took heed of the words of House Stark and knew that winter was coming, and so they would prepare during the warmer months to last out the winter. They would stockpile their wheat and barley, and to protect it from rodents and from the damp, they would first lay down a layer of gorse or another thorny plant on the floor of the barn, and this kept the grain raised off the wet floor, and the thorns made it more difficult for vermin to come up through the boards. Now, when it came to meat, you would pretty much not be eating anything fresh. The summer and fall were the time to fatten the livestock, and then come November, it was time to slaughter them. For many people, the festival of Martinmas on November 11th was one of the last big feasts of the year that would include fresh beef. Once everyone had had their fill, then everything else was going to be saved for winter. And this is where they really excelled at preparation, because pretty much all parts of the animal could be preserved. Certain organ meat would be pickled, while the blood would be made into blood sausages and black puddings, which, when kept cool, could last for months. Then the majority of the meat was destined to be either dried, smoked, or salted. Meat could be made into sausages and then hoisted over smoking fires. Often you could just hang them in the rafters of your own house, because even though you would have a hole in the roof to let the smoke out from the fire, it was still pretty filled with smoke up in the rafters because the chimney had been invented, but it was mostly in just a handful of stone buildings at this time. So the roof was pretty much filled with smoke, which was great for smoking sausages. Brilliant. But the majority of the meat was destined for being brined or salted. They would either brine the meat or in addition to that, pack it tightly in salt and store it for months or sometimes even longer. The great news was that it would last throughout the winter. The bad news was that all your meat was really salty and really tough. And this is why, especially during the winter, everything was boiled. During the summer, you might see fresh meat being roasted, but mostly during the winter, it had to be boiled for a few hours before just to make it edible. It was not uncommon, even during the summer, to boil meat before roasting it, because medieval Europe just loved boiled meat. Now, some cows, along with some goats and sheep, would be kept back to make more cows, goats, and sheep the next year, as well as to provide the house with milk, butter, and cheese. Butter and cheese being an excellent way to preserve the milk, but again, it would have been very, very salted at this period, both the butter and the cheese. Most of the animals, though, were slaughtered come November, though there were two that got a month of reprieve: geese and pigs. And this was because once fall hit, you didn't have to feed them anymore. Instead, they were allowed to gorge themselves on worms and acorns until December. But come December, they too were destined for the butcher block, which is why in many calendars from the medieval period, December includes images of pigs being slaughtered. Pork was a very important meat for most people to see them through the winter because, frankly, most people didn't have access to cows because they were very, very expensive. Pigs, on the other hand, most people could afford to keep at least a few around. But keeping them around through winter, well, that was a different story, because every pig was just another mouth to feed, and so most of them were destined to become salt pork or bacon before Christmas. But what about fish, you may ask? Surely everyone could just go catch some fish in a stream or a pond throughout the winter, right? Well, no. In many places, the common peasant was actually forbidden to fish no matter the time of year. If you lived on a lord's land, and pretty much everyone lived on a lord's land because that's kind of how feudalism worked, then it would be up to that lord if he would allow you to fish in his ponds, rivers, and streams, and the vast majority said no. There were a handful of estates during the Middle Ages that did allow their tenants to fish at will in their streams and whatnot, but that was the exception and not the rule. Now, if you did happen to live near the ocean, well, that was pretty much fair game for the most part, but fishing on the ocean during the winter was pretty dangerous, namely because of the weather. But just because you didn't get fresh fish during the winter, that doesn't mean you didn't get any fish, because just like the meat, you could have preserved fish. Herring, for example, were often salted or pickled and could be kept through the winter and sold to those living inland, and then there were the infamous stockfish, which was usually made of cod. Stockfish was not salted, but dried and cured in a process of fermentation. This fish could last for years and years on end, but it was so hard and dried that it had to be beaten with a mallet, kind of like hardtack. Then once it was softened up, it usually had to be boiled just like the salted meat for a very long time just to make it edible. In the book of Marjorie Kemp from the early 15th century, she tells a story of Jesus coming to her and saying, "Thou shalt be eaten and gnawed by the people of the world, as any rat gnaweth the stockfish. Daughter, for you are so buxom to my will, and cling as sore unto me as the skin of stockfish clings to a man's hands when it is boiled." Lovely, really paints a picture. Though I actually really want to try stockfish and I want to actually make it. It requires a lot of planning, but maybe that's an upcoming long-term project for the channel. Now, surviving a winter during the Middle Ages did mean mostly a diet of dried and preserved foods, but there were some fresh, or at least non-preserved foods that you could eat. Things like chestnuts, walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts were typically eaten throughout the winter and were especially important during Lent. This 40-day period during the winter meant a complete abstention from meat, eggs, and dairy. Now, the meat part wasn't so hard because a lot of people had actually eaten through most of their meat by the time Mardi Gras came around, but the dairy was a little bit harder because milk was used in a lot of dishes and a lot of cooking during the period, so they would have to make almond milk or hazelnut milk, and they're actually made pretty much the same way that they're done today, though Some were made with water, but many times, instead of water, it would be made with beer or wine. Another fresh item that you might eat would be a fresh fruit or vegetable on occasion. Most, of course, would be long gone or else dried to within an inch of its life by now, but things like apples and pears were often able to last into the cold of February, and vegetables such as cabbages and leeks were commonly grown and harvested throughout even the snowiest months. Then there were radishes, which according to the 13th century scholar Bartholomeus Anglicus, or Bartholomew the Englishman, were most important to eat during the winter. See, medicine was still based on the idea of the four humors, which were kept in balance partly by eating foods designated hot, cold, wet, and dry. Well, the ravages of winter, which was considered to be wet and cold, could be combated with a hot, dry food, which radishes were considered. Heat burns in the fat matter of the root. In winter, it is a reservoir of heat, and gathers itself to another and is multiplied. So to survive a medieval winter, it was all about preparation, gathering up enough food that it could see you through those coldest months, because most people did not have the ability to buy a lot of food. But if you lived in a city or even a large town, you might not have the space to store all of that food or even grow it in the first place, so you were going to have to buy your food, and it was going to cost you. Except for those few items with government price controls, namely ale and bread, all other food prices rose during the winter. For instance, should you find yourself having to travel and stay the night at an inn, you would have to pay not only for your own food, but also that of the horse you rode in on, supposing you weren't on foot. Well, in the 1340s in England, stabling your horse for the night and having them fed would cost about 1.5 pennies during the summer and 3.5 during the winter. And not only did food prices rise during the winter, but your wages actually shrank. Winter meant that there were fewer hours in the day, and this meant that your daily wages would be cut. For instance, in London in the 1340s, a tiler, that is someone who made floor tiles and roof tiles, would earn 5.5 pennies in the summer, but only 4.5 during the winter. So between the rise in prices and the cut in pay, the average city dweller during the period could spend over 70% of their income just on food. And there is a wonderful quote from Bartholomew the Englishman about this. It's actually about plants and whatnot growing, but it works with your savings as well. He says that all things that lived and sprang by the benefit of summer fade and die by the hard cruelness of winter. And that's why instead of some succulent chicken or spiced roast pork for this winter episode, I decided to make this simple porridge for a medieval peasant. And here we are, frumenty from the 14th century. So it does have this yellowness to it, which I kind of love. And you could have made it even more yellow with more saffron or more egg yolks. Here we go. Interesting. Now, does it need sugar and spices? I think it would really help, but it's actually much more flavorful than I had expected because of the eggs. Because the wheat, kind of bland, but the eggs add this like richness to it. So I can see why it would be a lot more filling than just something like oatmeal. There is, I mean, it's like packed with calories. So probably a much smaller bowl would do. So it's actually really good. And I can see that this would keep you warm and full all day long, no matter what, really. I also really love the texture. It's not mushy. The wheat berries have kind of held themselves together, and so each one kind of like pops in your mouth, I guess. Like they're soft enough to eat, but not so soft that they become just mush. I actually kind of like that. I would probably add a little sugar or some cinnamon or other spices that they would have been using at the time. But yeah, it's actually better than I had expected. So make some frumenty, keep warm, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.